There's a very formative and vulnerable period in any life cycle, in any pattern. In a garden, when you first plant a redwood seed, you don't even see any green. It's just a few inches in size. And without a nurturing environment, it will never grow, ever. The entirety of that redwood will eventually rot out if not given a nurturing environment. And this is the vulnerability of new birth. It's also the vulnerability of attunement, because it's not just soil and water and light and oxygen that must be provided in order for a redwood tree to grow. It's the right ratio. If you put the seed under water for a few months, it will be dead, permanently dead. No more redwood. If you fully burn it in a fire, no more redwood. If it is starved of oxygen or light, by being buried too deeply, there's no redwood. It's only once it germinates, once it takes root and finds its shape, that it more rapidly than many trees becomes invincible, hard to stop. And the same is true with patterns in psychology, patterns of development. As the self finds its tether, its conscious connection with the biology of the brain, the biology of the body, it requires an attuned space to reach a certain level of maturity, or the very forces that would allow something to take off become the forces that ensure it will never leave the ground. And you can see this with wind patterns. If you've ever held your hand out of the car window as it's driving at high speed, you realize at some point, just tilting as the wind pressure increases, just tilting a little bit, and your hand bangs into the top of the door frame. If you've ever been out sailing, the same gust of wind that moves you along at a good clip can capsize a boat if there's too much sail. And what happens when the parent doesn't attune to the child, or the environment does not attune to anything new? I'm thinking of a new relationship that was very fragile and gentle, very beautiful, but very brittle, like a crystalline garden. And the client in my life at the time had such a tornado of weird and twisted energies that I'd come home from work disoriented, out of attunement with my own body, without the skill to navigate the blossoming, the beginning. And so I had to fire the client honorably, just directly. What do I need to do and say and pay you to disappear and have this be the last day? Okay, here you are. That relationship needed to lift off the ground lightly and skillfully, requiring presence and energy that I simply could not muster after dealing with that client. And it was a great choice, letting one of the best relationships of my life get off the ground, until eventually it became so solid, so seamless, that no client could faze it, but not at that stage. And one of the things that I'm looking at is, you can see these wind patterns here, and when wind patterns blow at 5 miles per hour, you've got a 5-foot sail, and you're there and you can tilt the angle up and down. You've got freedom. You've got real freedom. But with a 5-foot sail, maybe 5 by 10 feet, once the wind gets up above about 60 miles an hour, no amount of human strength, once it's flipped a certain way, and it's got that amount of wind pressure, the physical body lacks the ability to break the pattern unless there's a lull in the wind. You see, when this wind dies down, and you can flip it away. You can flip the angle. If it picks up again, it'll be in the same position. Now it'll be in the new angle and impossible to physically turn. And this draws attention to the incredible power and principle of attunement. The principle of attunement is that the more powerful force moderates its energy down to the level of the most vulnerable force within the environment in order to facilitate growth. This is common sense in relationship. Two people go on a walk, and the person who's slow can speed up a bit, but the taller, faster walking person, in order to stay on a walk together, needs to slow down their pace to the point at which they become in sync. Two people in a relationship dealing with a difficult topic need to slow down to the point at which the slowest person can still digest the information. Someone feeding you a delicious meal. The same principle. If you start to be stuffed in your mouth faster than you can chew, taste, and digest, it moves from an orgiastic experience into one of revulsion, gluttony, and disgust. This is principle of attunement. Now, one of the things that's occurring for me right now, after decades of psychological pressure on the part of my parents, on the part of my culture, and years of pressure within the high community, particularly the facilitator body, is a lull in the unbearable wind force. I've had many dreams, many experiences in which I feel myself under a wall that's collapsed under me, that's collapsed over me, under a car that's so heavy I can't push it up. And I look at myself in those dreams, in those images, and I feel the incredible sense of helplessness, that there's a mass over my body that's bigger than my body is capable of lifting off. And it's so frustrating because in these montages, in these dreams, as soon as the car is off me, as soon as the wall is off me, there's nothing to stop me achieving and doing all the many things that I want to do. And yet without help, that weight will never go away because this body is not capable of lifting that amount of weight off of my body from a crushed position as I'm under that rubble laying down flat. And with that comes an enormous amount of depression, terror, helplessness, age regression, shock, grief, trauma, and loneliness. Because no one knows I'm buried under that wall. Because no one sees me laying under a car that's fallen on top of me. And I've woken from these images and asked myself, how can I get out? The weight is so heavy. The wind force is so strong. And one of the conditions that's necessary for hatred is powerlessness. And I've watched the hatred bubble in the combination of helplessness, powerlessness, shame, tremendous pain and loneliness, and invisibility. And I've understood. This is why people become violent. This is why people go sour. This is why people break. Spending too long in this frozen place amidst an energy that refuses to regulate itself and attune to the capacity of the child, to the capacity of the individual, of the partner. And I've seen these patterns in other people, and it's helped me to understand. It's helped me to understand. People are not bad people. They become increasingly destructive when they're frozen in positions of profound pain and profound helplessness, buried behind these walls that nobody sees, that nobody wants to see, that nobody wants to understand and help lift off. Now, we don't live in a world where this kind of dialogue has a place. Meaning, I don't know people who have the presence and the respect for these domains to make going into them intelligent, a source of hope as opposed to increased bitterness. And that in turn leads to excruciating vulnerability and invisibility. Now, as I receive support, and frankly, I don't know entirely where and how that works, but what I did from that place, that psychological sandwich, was I orchestrated my outer reality to become safer and safer. Marrying a lovely, sensitive woman, creating a relationship with our dog, buying a dog, creating a relationship with our dog, attending to various traumatic events on the outside, and creating a nest, meditation, asking for help, working with energy, writing, poetry, art, spending time by the water. This systematic behavior of de-stressing the environment, combined with asking for help and receiving blessing, receiving energy and help, has let the wind die down, the force of the environment, and with it the force of fear. Because with strong winds and a fixated position comes the fear of helplessness and the fear of failing, the awareness of just how heavy these objects are. And so, having created a lull and experiencing some flexibility, I'm now experiencing the transformation from hatred, from terror, from grief, from loneliness, and from tunnel vision. The kind of vision we develop when the reality is so overwhelming that we cannot afford to look at it without being overwhelmed. And so we create tunnel vision, which once created creates its own sources of anxiety because I understand tunnel vision. When I have tunnel vision, I don't see clearly enough to gracefully navigate all aspects of my reality. And as a result, I feel anxiety about when I'm going to bump into the next thing that I don't see. I can afford to see more now, which means that anxiety calms down. I can afford to be more present and in my body, which means my muscles relax. With relaxed muscles comes the ability to rest my adrenals. With the ability to rest my adrenals comes sleep and dreams. And so this process of escalating beyond the ability to move and pivot because the forces were too strong, and now de-escalating to a point where I can navigate. Because a nice point is this grace point in the middle, where it's neither up nor down. Because as long as you keep a hand on the rudder, when you're just going slightly up and slightly down, now you've got control even in relatively high winds. Kind of like the difference between trims on a plane and the entire wing going up at a 45-degree angle and stalling the plane. We need these little micro turns. And it's my belief that a great deal of the mental emotional disease, of the dissociative insanity, relates to our people being locked in a fixated position in thinking and feeling and image and identification with forces that will not attune and regulate and soften that gear. And now that fixed position has become the primary identity, where the dis-ease, the asymmetry, becomes the self-definition. It's a beautiful experience to be able to lift out of this frozen place. It's a beautiful experience to be able to lift out of this frozen place. And I don't know entirely where it's going. I just know that I've known this for more than 2 years. And for more than 2 years, from a kind of remote control mental program, I've been lining up pieces of reality to reduce fear. And in the process, have gained the support to lift those heavy weights off and start moving again, start flowing again. And one of the gems from this experience is the understanding that at any point in these decades, 7 people had the strength to lift that vehicle off, had the strength to tip the wall off of my body, and I could jump up as good as new. And if this lull had not come, I'd still be pinned down there, rotting, mentally, emotionally, physically, with no hope of emerging. Now, where does this go, and how does it tie in with abuse? Well, the key is in the word. To use and to partner, to use well, and to abuse, the absence of good use. It's not good use to have a 5 by 20 foot sail up in 60 miles an hour wind on a small 2-person sailboat. It's not good use. A couple of feet of sail is all you need to move along at a good pace. It's abuse for the busyness and stress of our world to lay itself down, unregulated, on our children. It's abuse. And we lose so much of our potential as a species, as a country, as a community, when we fail that point in attunement.